Back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, there was a very large movement within, especially the personal development realm, but just, I think, in general amongst the culture, that there was a notion that to become great at anything, you had to devote about 10,000 hours to doing it. I don't know if that's still talked about today. I don't know if that's still promoted or not. I don't know if that's part of the current zeitgeist. But again, like 2000, I don't know, like 8 to maybe like 20. It seemed like 2008 maybe to like 2015 or something like that. People talked about that all the time. I remember being in college, and you had professors that would mention that. There were people when I was kind of getting into the workforce that would talk about that a lot. All the way down to when I was doing jiu-jitsu, to being told that basically to become a black belt, you had to tap out 10,000 times. It was a very nice growth statement too. It was never you had to tap the other guy out. You yourself had to be beaten 10,000 times before you ever got your black belt. And in truth, it made a lot of sense. Typically 10,000 hours, I think in like conventional speak ends up being like 10 years or something like that. Within the jiu-jitsu realm, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, 8 to 10 years probably to get a black belt, something like that. In that, some people take longer. I knew one guy who was a purple belt for probably was a purple belt for a decade. Just at that same, he spent a decade doing jiu-jitsu and only got to purple belt because he had a really hard teacher and he moved around a lot and all that stuff. But the 10,000 hour rule seemed to be pretty prevalent. I don't know how true that is, though, within the writing realm. If I took all the time that I've put into this over the course of now 8 years, something like that, I think, what is it? 9 years. So 9 years in, I don't know how close I've ever become or I've ever come to getting to that 10,000 hours. If you do 365 days times 9, that's 3,285 days. Assuming that you put in 1 hour a day. Yeah, that's about a third of the way towards the mastery. Right? Us writers tend to put in a lot less time at the keyboard than other professions. But maybe that is true. Perhaps there's something to be said for that 10,000 hour rule, right? So if you've done it for an hour a day for about that time, about 10 years, you're getting about a third of the way to mastery, which is often why perhaps myself and other writers, very commonly say, it took me about a decade of writing before I ever got a single publication. So maybe there is something to that. It's the publishing process is a very long journey. It's fraught with a lot, and it's not ever easy. David Sedaris, I think, had said something to the effect of it took him about 10 years to get his first publication too. So if we're thinking in terms of like how long this journey is, 10 years you get to a third, so at 30 years in you finally hit mastery. It feels accurate. You start writing in your 20s, and then by the time you're in your 50s you become a quote unquote master. It feels close. That's oftentimes when people's magnum opuses tend to come around, is in their kind of middle age, late middle age, even some of their advanced years. If you look at people that won the Pulitzer Prize, for example, for fiction, right? Often they are well into their middle ages. So there might be something to be said for that. Might be something to be said for that rule. I always felt like it was very ambiguous thing. Because there's no way to really metrically track that in terms of how much effort you put in, right? You could spend an hour just not doing any deliberate work, like no feedback at all, but does that count? to what degree do you have to be focused? It seemed like there was so much to it that the examples that were given often when these accounts of the 10,000 hour rule came through, I was like, I was never really that sold on it. But I did think that there was something to be said for putting in a lot of that time that you probably were going to get better. Just because the more time you put into something, generally speaking, you will get better at it. But we'll see. We'll see. I'm a third of the way. I'm probably somewhere around a third of the way. Yeah. And that's taking like a rough average here. I mean, an hour a day for 9 years, I've probably, you see me now doing like about 9-minute sessions now. Yeah, there were days long before I did the every day where I was missing sessions, etc. that averaged it out. But there are plenty of days where I was writing for 2-hour sessions. I had just a couple months ago I had an 8-hour session, right? So there's so many variances with writing, but typically we don't write for very long. Most of us are not at the keyboard for very, very long, and so I kind of hope that's not true. I'm sort of hoping that it is not that it's you don't need to have that many hours put in to reach mastery, which I guess leads to two final caveats, which is mastery does not mean entry. You don't have to have hit the mastery 10,000 hours to get something published, to get into the kind of get your foot in the door, right? You don't need to be at that point. That's when you are like the highest expert in your field. In theory is what the term mastery tends to connotate. And the other thing too is, if it is true, that does work to the advantage of the person who's very dedicated, because the more time you put into it, the further you go along. In theory, other people are watching out. You're constantly having writers watch out. There are people that get to certain points and quit. They get to points and they get frustrated. They get no success, etc. So if you're sticking with it, maybe you have kind of a nice advantage there the longer you go into it over others. If you view this as sort of a competitive thing. I tend to think that the writing realm is big enough that you don't need to compete. You don't have to fight with other people, especially now. Like, my God, there are so few readers in the world, like readers, like especially in America, like so few people that are actually reading books. It's like you get way, way, way further collaborating with other people and trying to appeal to that market than trying to divide that market up. But all right. So I'm going to sign off here. I will see you all tomorrow.